So good afternoon, everybody. Let's put ourselves in the mood with a little Christmas carol. Okay, what am I talking about here? We're looking at the Gospel of St. Matthew and the account of the Magi and the star in the east. And we're asking ourselves, are there any astronomical candidates that could possibly explain the account of the Star of Bethlehem? How many possibilities are there, and how well do they fit the account in the Gospel of St. Matthew? And we'll have a look at some astronomical dates. What actually happened some 2,000 years ago? What was in the sky? And do any known events fit the timeline that we're trying to work to? And at the end, I'll jump to some videos of some astronomical software, some planetarium software that shows us what was going on in the sky a few years BC. And then I'll quickly summarize at the end. So, what is it that we're trying to explain? What are the principal elements of Matthew's account? So I'm no biblical scholar, but I've tried to take the Gospel of St. Matthew and pick out the 5 relevant things that we're trying to explain here. When the Magi journeyed to Jerusalem, they were prompted by a star in the east. So the Star of Bethlehem has to start somehow with the appearance of a star in the east. Note that it does not say in the Bible that they followed the star. The Christmas carol does, but the Bible doesn't say they followed a star in the east. It says they were prompted by the appearance of a star in the east. They went to Jerusalem and asked Herod, "What's this we hear about the birth of the King of the Jews?" And Herod didn't really know what they were talking about. He was unaware of such a prophecy. The Magi then journeyed to Bethlehem, where the star reappeared in the south and stopped over Bethlehem. So those 5 things that I've highlighted in red are the 5 aspects of the account that we need to try and explain. If we want to come up with what we think was the Star of Bethlehem, then if we're going to say that that's an explanation for what appeared in the Gospel of St. Matthew, then we really need to hit each of those 5 bullet points, as it were, those 5 items highlighted in red. Or at the very least, we need to be able to account for 4 out of 5 of them. Let's go back through the first words again. That's enough of that for the time being. We 3 kings of Orient are, and at the end of that verse, following yonder star. Well, I know this is only a Christmas carol, but it's worth starting from here just as a point of reference. When we think of we 3 kings, we should remind ourselves that the Bible doesn't talk about 3 people, 3 magi, visiting the baby Jesus. The only reason that we tend to think of them as 3 people is because the Bible mentions the fact that these people who came, these magi, these wise men who came for the adoration of the magi, it's mentioned that they brought 3 gifts: gold, frankincense and myrrh. And if they brought 3 gifts, then presumably there were 3 people, but it doesn't actually say that. So this idea of the 3 wise men, or the 3 kings, or the 3 magi, the 3 is rather invented. All we know is that there were 3 gifts. It could be that 3 people brought gifts and there were another 17 people there with them, but they didn't realise they were supposed to bring anything with them. So we really shouldn't have the 3 in this Christmas carol, because there's no evidence that there were 3 magi. And they certainly weren't kings. The Bible refers to magi or wise men. They could have been astrologers, but they weren't kings. So we shouldn't really be talking about kings either. And we don't know where they came from. They came from somewhere to the east of Jerusalem. Was it Persia? Don't know. Was it India? Don't know. Was it the Far Orient? We don't know. So we can't really pin down any geography of where these these individuals who might have numbered 3, where they came from. So we shouldn't put Orient in there either. And as I've just mentioned on the previous slide, when we look at the account according to St. Matthew, it does not say that they followed the star. It says that they were prompted by a star in the east, appearing in the east. So they didn't follow yonder star. So you can see this Christmas carol is rapidly starting to fall to pieces when we actually analyse it. Now, I'm a scientist, so I tend to look at things and I like things to be precise. And if there weren't 3 and they weren't kings and they didn't come from the Orient necessarily and they didn't follow a star, then we really shouldn't be putting those words into the Christmas carol. We really ought to rewrite the Christmas carol more precisely. And it would end up being something like, we, indeterminate number of men of unspecified geographic origin are. And instead of following yonder star, it should just say, saw a star. Yes, I know it doesn't meter quite as well, and now you can see why scientists don't write Christmas carols. And whenever we talk about the 3 wise men, we should really talk about the n wise men, where n is a number greater than 1 because it's plural, but less than some large number like infinity, perhaps. And when we talk about the Star of Bethlehem, we must remind ourselves about what we mean by a star. A star doesn't necessarily mean a star in the sense that we understand it in the astrophysical sense today. A star means something seen in the night sky. Remember that there are labels such as a wandering star, which is what we now call a planet. There are fixed stars which seem to be in the same place relative to each other. They're not fixed in the sky in the sense that as the Earth rotates, the sky appears to rotate, but they are fixed relative to each other. So we have fixed stars and we have these wandering stars that move relative to all the other fixed stars, and these are objects that we now call planets. And we know, of course, that these are objects moving within our solar system. But there are other visitors like comets, which used to be called hairy stars because they appeared quite often to have a relatively small nucleus that looks a little bit star-like, but then they might develop quite significant tails coming out of the back as they moved across the sky. So hairy stars, what we now call comets, visitors to our solar system, or perhaps from further out in our solar system coming a little bit closer to Earth. And of course everybody knows shooting stars. It's one of these particular phrases that's actually still used, although we do tend to call them meteors. Again, it's quite often used in colloquial English that we call them shooting stars. So you can see wandering stars, hairy stars, shooting stars, as well as fixed stars. A star doesn't mean a star. It could be essentially anything seen in the night sky. Right, okay, do we get any clues if we look at other sources of information, not the account according to St. Matthew, but what about paintings of the Adoration of the Magi, for instance? Does that give us any indication about the Star of Bethlehem? Well, in this painting by Botticelli, there appears to be a Star of Bethlehem over the heads of Joseph, Mary and the baby Jesus. It doesn't show up particularly clearly as it's almost truncated by the top of the picture there. So we don't learn anything much. It is often thought that this is Botticelli himself who sort of photobombed his own painting, as it were, staring back at the person viewing the painting. In this particular case, at the back there, you can see a rather disinterested looking Joseph who appears to be taking no part in the celebration whatsoever. But maybe that's appropriate, as allegedly he took no part in the conception either, so that's probably right. If we look at other depictions of the Adoration of the Magi, again in the background there above Joseph we see an indication of the Star of Bethlehem, but of course it's an artistic representation. We don't necessarily learn anything about the nature of the star by looking at paintings such as these. Giotto went against the grain slightly by indicating the Star of Bethlehem not as a point or a disc, but as something that appears to have a hairy tail on it. So it looks like Giotto represented the Star of Bethlehem as a visiting comet. And he's one of the few artists that decided to go in that direction rather than depict the Star of Bethlehem as what we would consider to be a normal star. Do we learn anything from Rubens? I looked at this one, but I couldn't actually see any indication of the Star of Bethlehem in the background, which is normally in most of these paintings of the Adoration of the Magi. All we have in the background of this one appears to be a two-headed camel rather than any depiction of anything astronomical or astrological in the sky. And so again, we see an indication which would generally be interpreted as probably a star, not a comet with a tail, but a star beaming some of the radiance down in the direction of Jesus. And we see that as a common theme in a number of these paintings, such as Van Lint from the 1600s. Again, what appears to be a point-like star in the sky shining down onto Jesus. So it's not surprising, perhaps, that any artistic representation of the Star of Bethlehem is not necessarily an accurate indication of what it is. It's what the public would have expected to see in a painting of the time. So do we get any clues? Well, not really, by looking at this sort of material. One thing that is important is astrology. So we can always say that we don't believe in astrology, but of course astrological significance was very important, especially in centuries gone by. Every planet, every bright star, every zodiacal constellation, in other words, every constellation in which the sun appears to move through in the strip as the Earth goes round the sun in that plane, we look at those constellations and the sun appears to move through those constellations every year. So each of those zodiacal constellations and each bright star in the region and every planet had a certain significance. It might vary a little bit depending on which culture on Earth you're looking at, but there were certain themes. For instance, the planet Venus being so incredibly bright for a lot of the year, seen in the morning or the evening skies, Venus was often associated with beauty or fertility or birth. And Jupiter was often seen as the king of planets. It was associated with royalty, and Jupiter, or Zeus if you prefer the alternative name, was considered the king of planets. And Regulus is the brightest star in the constellation of Leo, and as you can perhaps tell from the name, the REG there, the star Regulus was considered to be the king of stars. And the constellation itself, that Regulus is the brightest star in the constellation of Leo, was associated with the Lion of Judea. In other words, the state of Judea had a flag which had on it the depiction of a lion. So the lion in the sky, the constellation of Leo, was often associated with the state of Judea. Why did astrologers assign these levels of significance to the sky? Why did they believe it was relevant to talk about the significance of a planet or the significance of a star or a constellation? Well, it was because it was believed at the time, and for many centuries thereafter, that if you look at the sky, you are effectively reading, in a sense, the intention of what God has in mind for the rest of humankind. If God was intending to throw down a plague, or to have a particular disruption to everybody's lives, if the crops were going to fail, or if there was going to be a flood, or a famine, or a plague, well, this would be indicated by God placing in the sky certain signs which astrologers would be able to read and hence know what was going to happen in months to come or perhaps in years to come. So in a sense, one way of thinking about astrology is to treat the sky as God's Facebook page. That's where he posts anything of interest. So if you keep watching the sky, you'll get a heads up on what's likely to happen in the future. So what candidates do we have? Let's think about a few possible candidates for the Star of Bethlehem and ask ourselves if these candidates meet the criterion of could they be interpreted as a star appearing in the east to the Magi? Would it have been a significant appearance? Is there a reasonable explanation as to why Herod wasn't aware of what the Magi were saying? Is it possible that this star reappeared in the sky, and is it possible that the star would stop in the sky? So let's consider a few candidates. Could the star have been a shooting star, or a set of shooting stars, or a meteor swarm, or a meteor storm? Well, it's difficult to see how you can talk about a star appearing in the east. Meteors will appear essentially all over the sky during a meteor shower. and therefore you can't really say a star has appeared in the east. So that doesn't really fit. And meteor showers occur a few times every year, pretty much year on year on year. So it's difficult to see how you would apply any particular significance to the appearance of meteors in the sky. Is it possible that Herod wasn't aware of the significance? Well, yes, if it's a relatively insignificant event, of course Herod wouldn't know what the Magi were talking about. Is it possible for the shooting stars to reappear in the sky? Well, yes, meteors occur essentially every clear night, and meteor showers occur regularly throughout the year. So yes, a meteor shower might occur for a few days or a few weeks, and then another meteor shower might occur later on. So yes, it could definitely reappear. But could a meteor shower stop in the sky? It's not at all obvious how you could possibly interpret that. So shooting stars don't appear to be a good candidate for the Star of Bethlehem. What about the appearance of a comet? Could a comet appear in the east? Well, certainly comets could in principle appear in different parts of the sky. Could it have been significant? If it was bright enough, certainly a comet could be considered to be a harbinger of either good news or bad news, depending on the cultural significance. Is it possible that Herod wasn't aware of said comet if the Magi saw something in the sky? Well, if it's big enough and bright enough for the Magi to say, look, there's something interesting going on, surely Herod would have been aware of said comet. Could it reappear in the sky? Well, comets go around the sun, so it's possible for a comet to appear in the sky and then for a little while to disappear as it goes behind the sun from our perspective, and then it might reappear on the other side of the sun some days or weeks later. So it could reappear in the sky. Could a comet stop in the sky? Well, it's not really obvious how that could happen either, and it looks like the possible candidates for comets, we can't explain how one would stop in the sky. It is possible, depending on how the comet moves around the sun and how the Earth moves around the sun, it is conceivable that a comet might appear not to move much in the sky for a short period of time, but it doesn't seem to fit when we look at comets that were around at the time. What about a nova? What about a new star? Strictly speaking, not a new star, but a star that's been there for quite a while, but suddenly got quite a bit brighter. And so it might have been invisible to the naked eye for quite some time, and then for a short period became bright enough to be visible with the naked eye. Could such a nova have appeared in the east? Indeed it could. Would it have been significant? Well, if it was bright enough, it would have been considered to be astrologically quite a significant event. Is it possible that Herod wasn't aware of said nova? Well, Herod, perhaps himself, his eyesight is not too good, but he's got a whole team of astrologers to advise him about what's going on in the night sky. So if it was bright enough to pique the interest of the Magi, why wouldn't it have been bright enough for Herod to be aware of it? So that's a little uncertain. Can a nova reappear in the sky? Well, generally speaking, not. A nova is a brightening of a star's brightness, and that might be bright for quite a few days, maybe a few weeks, maybe a few months, and then it will tend to fade away again. Generally speaking, you wouldn't expect it to come back a month or two later and reappear in the sky. And when it comes to a star stopping in the sky, well, remember a nova is just a star. So it would be in the same position relative to all the other fixed stars all the time. In other words, it would not be moving relative to the fixed stars. So why would you say that this star stopped in the sky if it was never moving in the first place? So that doesn't seem to fit. And similarly, if we go with a supernova, not a star that's just temporarily brightening, but a star that's effectively come to the end of its life and blown itself to pieces, so a very bright nova, it's essentially the same argument. Yes, it could be significant, but once a star has blown itself to pieces, it generally doesn't do it a second time. So it's difficult to see how that star could reappear in the sky. And again, a supernova would be at a fixed position relative to the other fixed stars, so it's not moving, so why would you say the star stopped in the sky? So none of those four possible star candidates seems to fit the 5 aspects of the account of St. Matthew. But the 5th candidate, I think, possibly does. and that is a conjunction of planets. Planets are going round the sun. Every once in a while, planets will seem to be in the same part of the sky, because all the planets move at different speeds, and as they're moving around the sun, every once in a while they'll seem to line up and we see planets in the same part of the sky, just as we saw last Christmas, for instance, with Jupiter and Saturn. So the symbol I put next to the conjunction word down there, that little dumbbell symbol, is simply the astrological symbol for a conjunction of two planets. That could occur in the east. If the planets were bright enough, that would be considered significant. Is it possible that Herod wasn't aware of said conjunction? Well, he might have been aware of the conjunction of two planets, but didn't necessarily, or his astrologers didn't necessarily, assign the same significance to that event in the sky. And conjunctions can occur more than once. Planets are always on the move, so two planets might seem to be in the same part of the sky and then drift apart, and then a little bit later they can come into conjunction again. So yes, a particular conjunction of planets can reappear in the sky. Is it possible that the star stopped in the sky? And that indeed is yes, for a reason that I will show shortly. So firstly, let's just say a word about planetary conjunctions. So here we have a couple of planets, green and red. As seen from the sun, in this particular case, they are clearly in the same direction of the sky. But as they go around the sun, planets that are close to the sun move faster than planets that are further away from the sun. So as time goes by, those planets will no longer appear to be in the same part of the sky. They're now in different parts of the sky. But if you wait long enough, eventually a time will come here where they are again in the same part of the sky. And again, if we wait long enough, eventually it will be that those planets are in the same part of the sky again. They won't necessarily line up perfectly because the orbits of one planet and another planet are often tilted slightly relative to each other. And so when planets cross in the sky, they often pass within maybe a few degrees of each other, maybe even of a fraction of a degree with each other, but they often pass each other by one going slightly north or slightly south of the other. The other point we need to bear in mind is that from what I've just said, the inner planets move faster than the outer planets. So if we imagine that we're on, in this case, the green circle, let's imagine green represents the Earth and red represents one of the outer planets, which could be Mars or Jupiter or Saturn. Generally speaking, all the planets go round the sun in the same direction, so when we watch them move from night to night across our sky, in general they move from west to east as everything goes round the sun in the same direction. But remember, the inner planets are moving faster than the outer planets. So at three particular times I've shown here, we can see where would Mars appear to be if this red planet, for instance, indicated the position of Mars. Where would Mars appear to be in the sky? I've indicated by the grey lines roughly where it might be. But as the Earth is moving rather faster than Mars, remember the inner planets are rotating around the sun faster than the outer planets, it's possible for the Earth to overtake on the inside lane, and hence, whilst the Earth is overtaking Mars, it appears that Mars is moving backwards. Just like if you're on a motorway and you're passing a car at 60 miles an hour and you're doing 70 miles an hour, then of course the car you're overtaking appears to you to be moving backwards rather more slowly. So that means the planets in the sky, although they generally move from west to east across the sky, at certain times the outer planets might appear to move backwards. And hence you get this sort of zigzag pattern as indicated on the right. The planet moves from west to east, but at a certain point it will stop in the sky, start to move backwards, stop again, and then continue moving forwards. It's nothing to do with the planet itself, it's purely the fact that the planet is being overtaken by the faster Earth on the inside track, and hence for a few weeks or a few months it can appear like the planet is starting to move backwards. And if I just run that little animation again, generally it moves from west to east, but then it can stop in the sky, move backwards for a little while, stop again, and then start to move forwards. And it's purely the different speeds of the two planets, the planet Earth from which we're observing, and the planet that we are watching as it moves across the sky. So that's something we can bear in mind when we look at the simulation of the night sky, which I'll show in just a moment. But let's just have a look at the timeline. I've shown here a few years leading up to the birth of Christ. Now, one problem is we don't know when Christ was born. One thing to notice is that there is no year 0. It goes from 1 BC to 1 AD. If you ever try and look at what the sky looks like by looking at, for instance, some planetarium software on your phone or on your iPad or on your laptop or on your computer, if you're using some planetarium software, it's worth checking whether or not it inserts a year 0, because there is a bug in some programs in which it goes, if you count backwards, 2 AD, 1 AD, 0, 1 BC, 2 BC, etc., which is incorrect. There should be no year 0. So let's just ask ourselves when Christ was born. And one possibility is that Christ was born somewhere between 4 BC and 8 BC. How do we know that? Well, it's based on various other events that were chronicled at the time. And one of the most important is, when did King Herod die? Because of the story about King Herod and the baby Jesus, then Jesus was born before King Herod died. And some people believe that Herod died in about 4 BC. But other scholars believe that King Herod actually died a little bit later. Now, I'm no biblical scholar, so I can't really decide. It is thought that the events that were describing the death of King Herod talked about Herod dying at a particular time of year after an eclipse of the moon, which followed a particular flood, etc. And it's thought that maybe they've got the eclipse of the moon wrong, which means that King Herod actually died in something like 1 BC, in which case Jesus Christ might have been born in a year or two prior to 1 BC. Quite why we end up with a gap between 3 and 4, I don't know, but the point is there's a great deal of uncertainty as to when Christ was born. But if we look at what was actually around at the time, we can say with some certainty, well, there was a comet around in 12 BC. It was Halley's Comet, and it might have been quite bright. But you ask yourself, if God is posting things on his Facebook page by placing a comet into the sky, why would he have placed Halley's Comet in the sky so many years before the appearance, before the birth of Jesus? So although Halley's Comet could have been quite spectacular at the time, it seems to be a little bit early. There are a couple of other comets, one there at 5 BC, that was Comet Holmes. Perhaps some of you caught that. If you're interested in astronomy, you might have caught Comet Holmes when it came round a few years ago, but it's not thought that that would have been particularly bright. Another comet appeared in the sky at 4 BC. Well, I say appeared in the sky. It was in the right position to be visible, but it's not obvious that it was bright enough to be visible. That's Comet Churyumov-Gerasimenko, the rather mouthful of a comet that was visited by the Rosetta mission, and little lander Philae landed on that particular comet. So we know that it was in the right part of the sky, but generally speaking, we would expect that comet to be very faint. That's one of the problems with comets. We can easily work out where they are in the sense of, if we know what their orbit is and how long it takes to go around the sun, we can figure out where they are now, where they will be in the future, where they have been in the past. But trying to work out how bright they would have been is very difficult. Comets are like cats. They've got tails and they're unpredictable. So we can say that those comets were in the right part of the sky. It's very difficult to say they would have been bright enough. It's very unlikely that the comets of 4 and 5 BC would be bright enough to be an explanation for the Star of Bethlehem. What about novae? Yes, there are records. In 5 BC, there's a record from the Chinese about the appearance of a nova. And there's also records from Korea of an appearance of a nova in 4 BC. Now, you wouldn't expect bright nova that are bright enough to be recorded by the naked eye, you wouldn't expect them to come along very often. So maybe it's like buses. You wait for ages and then 2 come along at once. It's actually more likely that there's been a slight transcription error of exactly when those nova appeared in the sky. And it's more likely, perhaps, that those are 2 records of the same nova appearing somewhere around late 5 BC, early 4 BC. But we've said earlier that the appearance of a nova, a fixed star, doesn't seem to fit the facts. But what about conjunctions? Yes, there were definitely some interesting conjunctions, and here I'm using the symbols explained in the bottom left just for simplicity. There was a conjunction between Jupiter and Saturn in about 7 or 6 BC, which some people have taken to be the Star of Bethlehem. But there's also a conjunction of Venus and Jupiter in about 3 or 2 BC. And although, yes, the 6 BC conjunction could indeed be the explanation for the Star of Bethlehem, I think this later one is actually very interesting. So yes, it hinges on the fact that King Herod died later than 4 BC, but if that did indeed happen, then this conjunction, or set of conjunctions, was actually a very interesting set of events. And what I'm going to do is to show you videos from Starry Night software. Rather than attempt to run the Starry Night software, just in case it didn't work properly, I ran it earlier and made videos so that we can see what it is I'm talking about. So sorry if it doesn't show up particularly clearly. We're ignoring the date in the top right, which is simply the date at which I made this video. Here's the date that's interesting, and I'll read it out in case you can't read it clearly. We're currently sitting at the 1st of August, 3 BC, at about tea time. I am not showing you what the view was like from Persia or India or somewhere else, because I don't know where the Magi were when these events took place. So I'm simply showing you the simulation of the sky as seen from the centre of the Earth, rather than placing it at a particular point on the surface of the Earth where I don't know where we should put the pin. Also, I'm not showing the horizon because that gets a little bit messy when the horizon is going backwards and forwards if we run this time lapse forward in time. I also haven't labelled everything in the picture because, again, the labels get too messy. So what we actually have here is the constellation of Leo, the lion, and there's the brightest star in Leo, the brightest star being Regulus. And here we have the planet Jupiter, which I've labelled, and this is the planet Venus, which I haven't labelled because the labels start interfering with each other. And what I'm showing in the next video is a time lapse of what happens in the sky if you were to watch Leo. Because again, if we didn't do that, then Leo would be rising and setting and rising and setting, and it would get very complicated. So let me run this video forward a little way from the 1st of August and see what happens. You notice that the planets tend to be moving backwards and forwards on this line. This is the line of the zodiac, if you like. This is the plane of the Earth's rotation around the Sun, and indeed most of the other planets. So on this particular day, what are we talking about here? The 12th of August, 3 BC, Venus and Jupiter get very close to each other, a fraction of a degree apart. Remember, the full moon diameter is about half a degree. And at this point, Jupiter and Venus would have been closer together in the sky than the diameter of the moon. So this would have been quite an interesting event. The very bright Jupiter, magnitude perhaps -4 or so, magnitude of Venus at about -4, and the magnitude of Jupiter somewhere between -2 and -3, would have meant we had two very bright points of light in the sky getting very close to each other. Still resolvable as 2 points of light, but quite close in the sky. Closer, for instance, than we saw Jupiter and Saturn last year. And this would have happened at a time of day which would have meant that this particular conjunction of these two bright lights in the sky would have happened just before sunrise. It would have been visible as a star in the east. Venus and Jupiter in conjunction in the constellation of Leo. Venus, birth. Jupiter, king. Leo, the line of Judea. Birth, king, Jew. That's one way of interpreting the astronomical event of Jupiter and Venus being in conjunction in the constellation of Leo. One astrological interpretation is birth, king, Jew. So that might have told the Magi, or whoever they were in Persia, in other states, probably in Persia. That's how they might have interpreted this particular event in August of 3 BC. Something interesting is happening, and it's somehow related to birth of the King of the Jews. Let's run the clock forward. We're now running through the latter part of 3 BC. Jupiter's moving quite quickly. Notice that Jupiter has just passed very close to the bright star Regulus. The king of planets has just passed the king of stars. Maybe that's important as well, say the astrologers, who are now staring at the sky quite intently. Notice that Jupiter has now stopped in the sky. It's no longer travelling from west to east. It's stopped and is now moving backwards. Remember, that's not Jupiter changing its direction. That's just the Earth overtaking it and making it look like Jupiter's gone backwards. Jupiter has just passed Regulus a second time. The king of planets has passed the king of stars twice now. Jupiter has now stopped in the sky a second time and is now resuming its west to east motion. And Jupiter passes Regulus a third time. The king of planets and the king of stars have just done a little dance around each other. So Jupiter moving backwards is nothing special. Jupiter passing Regulus is nothing special. But in this particular case, Jupiter has passed Regulus 3 times over a relatively small span of months. And after the Magi saw Venus and Jupiter in conjunction in Leo, they will definitely have noticed that the king of planets and the king of stars have just passed each other 3 times. Is this some sign of one king passing on to another king? Jupiter will continue its motion in just a moment, but I point out the fact that Venus is back again. Venus is going around the sun a lot faster than Jupiter is, and whilst we've been watching what Jupiter has been doing, Venus has gone round the sun and is coming back again. And so if we now run this video forward, Venus will now catch up with Jupiter one more time. So we're currently in May of 2 BC. Let's see what happens if we run the clock forward. Venus catches up with Jupiter, and Venus is in conjunction with Jupiter again. Not only in conjunction, this is a very, very close conjunction. They don't simply appear to be 2 points in the sky relatively close to each other compared to the size of the moon, for instance. These 2 bright points of light are now so close to each other they cannot be resolved as 2 objects in the sky. It looks for all the world like Venus and Jupiter have merged together. They are so close they cannot be separated without a telescope, which of course doesn't exist in these early days. We're relying on naked eye observations. Just how close did Jupiter and Venus get to each other? Well, as I say, they will appear to be a single object, but just for a laugh, let's imagine we had a telescope and let's zoom in to see how close they actually were. We're zooming in, zooming in, zooming in. There's Jupiter. Venus would have been blindingly white. This particular planetarium software shows the surface of Venus rather than the clouds of Venus, but it shows you that the apparent size of the disks are close enough that they actually touched. In terms of our line of sight, Venus being much closer than Jupiter, but in terms of the line of sight, they were so close they were a very small fraction of a degree apart. This particular field of view is 3 arc minutes by 1 arc minute, and most humans cannot see any objects that are separated by less than an arc minute. In other words, if we took those 2 planets and separated them by, let's separate them by 10 times as much as what we see here, then perhaps a individual with nice sharp vision would be able to make them out. But no one would have seen these at this conjunction distance. Nobody would have been able to make them out as 2 objects. They would have merged into one. That would have been a spectacular sight for a bright planet like Venus and a reasonably bright planet like Jupiter. For them to merge together would have been something that the Magi almost certainly would never have seen before, and possibly would never even have heard of before, in the sense it's not obvious how often this particular conjunction would take place. Perhaps a few times every 1,000 years, but within anybody's lifetime or the lifetime of their immediate relatives, it's unlikely that anybody would have seen anything like this conjunction. So let's remind ourselves what the Magi might have seen. In late 3 BC, they would have seen a relatively close, but not fantastically close, conjunction of Venus with Jupiter in the constellation of Leo. Venus, Jupiter, Leo, birth, king, Jews. That would have piqued their interest. When they watched what Jupiter was doing for the next few months, they would have seen the king of planets pass the king of stars not once, not twice, but 3 times over the next few months. And they may have interpreted that as one king is passing the crown to another king. They continued watching the sky, and in June of 2 BC, Venus and Jupiter were spectacularly close, to the point where they could not be resolved, and they merged into one particularly bright star in the sky, and that would have been the starting pistol that told them, whatever's happening, it's happening now, go to the land of Judea and pay homage to the new king of the Jews. Had they done that, they would have then perhaps continued watching the sky whilst they travelled to Jerusalem and ultimately Bethlehem. And it's interesting to note that Jupiter continued moving through the sky, just as we saw before, but actually Jupiter again stopped in the sky later on in 2 BC. On what date did Jupiter stop in the sky? It was actually the 25th of December, 2 BC. But of course that's a coincidence. We know the 25th of December is not necessarily something we should pay much attention to, because we know the 25th of December is simply the date of a pagan festival that was taken over in the name of Christianity sometime later. But it's just an interesting coincidence that Jupiter did stop in the sky on the 25th of December. And maybe that was around the time when the Magi actually arrived in Bethlehem. Again, we don't know where the Magi came from, therefore we don't know how long it took them between seeing a sign in the sky and actually arriving in Bethlehem. It might have been a relatively short distance they travelled from Persia, it might have been a much longer distance, but we don't know the mode of transport, and so it's all guesswork. But that is an interesting possible story to account for the Gospel according to St. Matthew. Maybe it was those conjunctions that inspired the account, which was of course written sometime after the Nativity. Maybe it wasn't. Maybe it was something else, or maybe it was a combination of events. Maybe it was a conjunction and a comet. Maybe it was a conjunction and a nova, or something else that occurred on a similar timeline that produced the account that we see in the Gospel of St. Matthew. Determining the astronomical facts, in other words, winding the clock back and saying that Venus and Jupiter did this on this day at this time, as seen from various points on the Earth, winding the clock back 2,000 years is not difficult. With our understanding of how the planets are moving, dialing forward thousands of years or dialing backwards thousands of years is not tricky. The tricky thing is second guessing what the significance that was applied to that. What did the Magi think, or what did Magi and other astrologers think about the significance of what they saw in the sky? That's something that is only second guessing, because we cannot, of course, be sure. We know about the astronomical facts, we're just guessing about the astrological significance of those facts. But regardless, the underlying message is of course the same. Although it's rather early, I will still wish you a Merry Christmas. Thank you for listening.